أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. What is the biggest number you can think of? I know this might be an odd question, but think about it for a moment. Take a moment, maybe pause the video, come up with the biggest number you can think of, and then feel free to let me know in the comments. Now, I hope you didn't say infinity. If you did, take another moment, go back. Infinity is not actually a number, so come up with. So we often loosely just throw infinity out there, right? We use the term infinity very loosely. We might say, I love you infinity, or to infinity and beyond, right? And even in math, you can easily get infinity just by dividing a number by 0. So a kid might do that in a calculator, type 1 divided by 0, might give an error, but sometimes it might say, well, it's infinity, right? So infinity comes to us very naturally, very easily. But to really grasp what infinity is, more seriously, infinity comes up in Islam, in religion, when we think about the divine. We say that God is infinite. God's attributes are infinite. God is infinitely greater than people, than anything, than any creation, right? But what I want to explore here is that because, again, we use infinity so freely, we don't really grasp what it means. It's sort of outside of the human mind, what we can grasp. But to better understand the magnitude and well, it doesn't really have a magnitude, but the greatness of infinity and the greatness of the divine, perhaps we can understand that by looking at big numbers, which is why I asked you, what's the biggest number you can think of? So let's start with a number that is basically at the limits of sort of what our minds can fathom, in a sense, or in the limits of what's a practically big number. Let's think about the number of atoms in the known universe, right? That's really outside of our reach, but it's something that we can sort of quantify in the physical world still. So what is that? It's around 10 to the 80, 10 to the power of 80, plus or minus, 2 orders of magnitude. But anyways, let's say 10 to the 80. So what does that mean? Well, one way to think about this number is, well, how would you write it? Well, obviously you can write 10 to the 80, but another way you can write it is 1 followed by 80 zeros. So you can see that here on the screen. It's a number I can write, and I can show you. But of course, it signifies something much larger, right? In fact, it signifies basically the entire universe that we can observe. And that's a pretty big number, right? But we can still think about it, we can still write it down, in a sense. But I can give you a number that's much bigger than this, right? I'm not talking about this number times 10, which would be 10 to the 81, right? I'm talking about a number that's really much, much bigger. Well, what would such a number be? Well, let's talk about 10 to the 10 to the 80. What is that number? Well, how would I write this number down? It would be 1 followed by 10 to the 80 zeros, which means 1 followed by a number of zeros that's equivalent to the number of atoms in the universe. So to write this number down, I would have to turn every single atom in the universe into a 0 just to be able to write this down. So I can't even conceivably write this number down in the universe, even if I had every atom to my disposal. Now, again, I can come up with a number that's even much greater than that. And I'm not going to go too far with this because at some point it just starts to mess with your mind, and we don't want to go there. But basically, if you want to, you could say, well, what if I do 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 10, where the number of tens is equal to the number I just mentioned. Again, these numbers are just beyond our reach. They're just too big to really comprehend. Now I want to explore an idea that is actually coming from Donald Knuth. Donald Knuth is a computer scientist, one of the foremost computer scientists in the world, and he wrote a series of books called The Art of Computer Programming, which he began writing these books in the 60s, and he wanted to write 7 volumes, and he's still working on volume 4 now. And he is also, in addition to being one of the foremost computer scientists, he's a devout Lutheran. He wrote a book which was a transcription of a series of talks he gave called Things a Computer Scientist Rarely Talks About. And in one of these talks, which I believe was titled God and Computer Science, he talked about basically big numbers, like the numbers I'm talking about here. And he came up with this number called super K, which I'm not going to define the number, but it's one of these really, really big numbers. And he says this: as soon as you begin to understand the immensity of super K, you will realize that just being finite isn't much of a limitation, and you will see how pointless are the philosophers' discussions about finite versus infinite. Infinity is a red herring. I would be perfectly happy to give up immortality if I could only live super K years before dying. In fact, super K nanoseconds would be enough. Now I realize that infinity is not necessarily even one of God's attributes. I'm quite willing to grant that God might indeed be infinite, and that God might have the power to examine infinitely many possibilities in an instant. But even the ability to deal with finitely many numbers, on the order of super K, is much more than enough to inspire awe. So Knuth is making an important and interesting point that some people might find heretical. Right? He's saying that because he understands the significance and the magnitude of these huge numbers like super K, he no longer sees the need for the infinite nature of God. Right? That even if God was only imagining super K possibilities, that's beyond anything that we could even comprehend. Right? Now, personally, I'm not going to go as far as to say this. I do believe that God is infinite, and one reason we might think that this is important is because, if something is finite, there's always something greater than it, in a sense, right? So infinity avoids that sort of philosophical conundrum. So let's say we do all agree that God is infinite. But this still gives us a point that we can't understand what infinity is because we devalue even the finite. When we think of finite numbers, we're really not really thinking about how great and how large these numbers can be. Now, why does any of this really matter, right? My point was that by understanding these large numbers, perhaps we can appreciate infinity, which we just throw out so loosely out there. Similarly, in religion, we sort of talk about God and we think about God in ways that really, of course, will never do justice, right? We can never do justice to God and the divine. But perhaps in order to better comprehend and better appreciate Allah and His powers and His bounties and His blessings, we can think about finite beings that are immense and much greater than we are. And that's why, as followers of the school of thought, the Ahlul Bayt, we look to the Ahlul Bayt, to the prophets and the Imams, and other great individuals like Fatima the Zahra, peace and blessings be upon them all. Because people might say, well, why not just go directly to God? Why do we have to have these intermediaries? Why do we talk about them so much, study them so much? Because in reality, they're human beings, they're finite. But they're on a level of finite that are far beyond us. So we can appreciate them, and by appreciating them, we can perhaps better appreciate what it really means that God is infinite. Because a finite, but immensely finite being, like a finite but immensely finite number, can perhaps inspire awe in us, like it did to Donald Knuth. And hopefully, like it might get you to think a little bit about how great some finite beings can be. And then to think about that they're still finite. And there's one out there that is infinite, the Creator who created all of these great beings, all of these great individuals. And hopefully that will help us better understand and appreciate the magnitude isn't even a word we can use here, but the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is of course a lifelong endeavor, as we'll never be able to truly understand. May Allah help us in better studying and learning from these great individuals, only to take us closer to Himself. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.